Tonight, let the snow guide your dreams to a quiet village called Hollowpine, where secrets lie buried beneath the frost and the warmth of Christmas feels just out of reach. There, two brave children, Margot and Elias, set out to bring light to a shadowed house and the heart of the woman within it. Journey with them as music weaves its magic, healing what was thought broken and reminding us all of the power of kindness, courage, and the simple glow of a red candle. Let this story wrap around you like a winter blanket, leading you into a peaceful and magical slumber. The snow whispered as it fell, soft as secrets, blanketing the village of Hollowpine in a pale, unbroken stillness. Its streets, usually alive with the bustle of the season, were eerily quiet that Christmas Eve, save for the occasional crack of an ice-laden branch or the soft rustle of wind through bare trees. Inside a modest, fire-warmed cottage near the village square, Margot and Elias watched the world outside transform into something both beautiful and unsettling. Margot, the elder of the two, pressed her small hand against the frosted window pane. "It's too quiet this year," she murmured, her breath clouding the glass. Elias, seated cross-legged beside the hearth, fiddled absently with a piece of string. "Quiet's not bad," he replied. "It means the snow is listening." His sister gave him a wry look, but said nothing. She knew better than to argue with Elias when he was in one of his peculiar moods. The boy had always seen the world differently, weaving stories from shadows and finding patterns in places others would overlook. Tonight, though, Margot felt the weight of the quiet more than usual. It pressed against her chest, heavy and strange, as if the village itself was holding its breath. The house across the square drew her gaze, a dark silhouette against the snow. The windows were shuttered, the chimney cold. It had stood that way for as long as Margot could remember, though she couldn't recall anyone ever saying why. "That house," she said suddenly, more to herself than to Elias. "The one at the end of Sparrow Lane?" Elias didn't look up. Margot nodded. "Why doesn't anyone go there? Even the carolers avoid it." "Because it's haunted," Elias said matter-of-factly, tying a knot in his string. Margot frowned. "Don't be silly, ghosts don't exist." "Maybe not the kind you're thinking of," Elias replied, his voice low. "But there are other ghosts, sad ones, invisible ones. Sometimes people carry them around like heavy coats, and they can't take them off." His words sent a shiver down Margot's spine, though she couldn't say why. "You mean Miss Winter?" Elias shrugged. "That's her name, isn't it? The lady who lives there. Or used to. Maybe she's a ghost too now." Margot turned back to the window, her brow furrowed. She didn't know much about Miss Elara Winter, only that the older children whispered stories about her, stories of curses, misfortune, and things that didn't bear repeating after dark. Margot didn't believe in curses, but she believed in loneliness, and she believed in the way a house could seem alive with sadness when its lights never shone. She crossed the room and knelt beside Elias. "Do you think she's still there?" Elias glanced at her, his dark eyes unreadable. Maybe she's waiting for someone to notice." Before Margot could reply, the soft creak of floorboards announced their parents' arrival. Their mother, carrying a tray of tea and biscuits, smiled faintly as she placed it on the table. "You two should be in bed," she said, though her tone was gentle. "Tomorrow is a big day." "We were talking about Miss Winter," Margot blurted, earning a sharp look from her father. "Miss Winter?" the mother echoed, her smile faltering. "Why doesn't anyone visit her?" Elias asked, his voice quiet but insistent. Their parents exchanged a glance, one of those silent conversations adults often had when they thought children wouldn't notice. Finally, their father sighed. "Some people prefer to be left alone," he said, "especially at this time of year." "But why?" Margot pressed. "Christmas isn't supposed to be lonely." Her mother knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Not everyone sees Christmas the same way, darling. For some, it's a season of joy. For others, it's a reminder of things they've lost." The words settled heavily in the room, snuffing out the children's questions like a gust extinguishing a candle. Still, Margot couldn't shake the thought that had taken root in her mind. As the fire crackled and her parents tucked them into bed, she whispered to Elias beneath the warm cocoon of blankets. "I think we should do something for her," she said. Elias blinked at her in the dim light, his face half hidden in shadow. "Like what?" "Bring her Christmas," Margot said simply. He didn't answer right away, but as the moonlight spilled through the frost-laced window, he finally nodded. "All right, tomorrow." And so the promise was made, a fragile, flickering thing, much like the snow's whispered secrets outside. Neither of them could have known how that promise would change everything. The snow had deepened overnight, turning Hollow-Pine into a world of white silence. Dawn crept in softly, its light fractured through icicles hanging from the eaves. Margot and Elias dressed in thick woolen layers, their breaths fogging the chill air as they packed a small wicker basket. Gingerbread cookies wrapped in crinkling paper, a stubby red candle, and a card scrawled in Margot's neat handwriting. Simple gifts, but chosen with care. Their mother stood at the door, her face a mask of hesitant concern. "You're certain about this?" she asked, her voice low. "It's Christmas," Margot replied firmly, her small chin lifted. Their father placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Be kind, but don't push too hard. Some doors take time to open." The children nodded, then set off down the snow-covered lane, their boots crunching softly with every step. The cold gnawed at their cheeks, but their excitement burned bright enough to keep it at bay. Sparrow Lane stretched before them like a path into another world, the snow undisturbed except for the faint tracks of a fox. The house at the end loomed larger with every step. Its shutters were closed tight, their paint peeling to reveal the weathered wood beneath. The roof sagged slightly under the weight of snow, and the skeletal branches of an old oak clawed at its eaves. "Do you think she'll even answer?" Elias asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "She has to," Margot replied, gripping the basket tightly. As they reached the porch, a chill deeper than the winter air settled over them. The house seemed alive, but not in a way that comforted. It exuded a silence so profound it felt like it might swallow their voices before they could even speak. Margot raised her hand and knocked, once, twice, 3 times. The sound echoed hollowly, as though the house itself were answering. For a long moment nothing happened. Then the door creaked open. Miss Elara Winter stood before them. She was taller than Margot had imagined, her frame cloaked in layers of dark fabric that hung like shadows around her. Her hair, streaked with silver, fell in loose waves, and her eyes, pale, sharp, and impossibly tired, studied the children with an intensity that made Margot's resolve falter. "What do you want?" Miss Winter's voice was soft but edged, like the wind before a storm. Margot held out the basket, her hands trembling slightly. "We brought you something. It's Christmas." Miss Winter's gaze dropped to the basket, lingering on the bright red candle. Her expression was unreadable, her face as still as the frozen pond behind the church. Finally, she stepped aside. "Come in then," she said, her tone more resigned than welcoming. The children exchanged a glance before stepping over the threshold. Inside, the house was as cold as the air outside, yet it felt far from empty. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and something faintly floral, lavender perhaps, or dried roses. The furniture was draped in faded cloth, the walls lined with bookshelves that sagged under the weight of their contents. A grand piano stood in the corner, its surface dusty and its lid closed, as though it had not been touched in years. Miss Winter led them into a small sitting room and gestured for them to sit. "You shouldn't have come," she said, her tone flat. "It's Christmas," Elias replied softly, echoing Margot's earlier words. Miss Winter let out a quiet, bitter laugh. "Christmas," she murmured, almost to herself. "A season for joy, they say, for light and laughter. What would you know of such things?" Margot's cheeks burned, but not from the cold. "We know enough to see when someone is lonely," she said, surprising even herself with the firmness in her voice. Miss Winter's gaze sharpened, and for a moment, Margot thought she might have gone too far. But then the older woman's expression softened, just enough for the children to glimpse the weight she carried. "You're braver than most," Miss Winter said quietly. She picked up the red candle from the basket and studied it for a long moment before setting it on the mantel. "Why did you bring this?" "It's for light," Margot said. "Everyone should have light on Christmas." Miss Winter's lips twitched, as though she might smile, but the gesture didn't quite reach her eyes. She moved to the mantel and struck a match, the flame catching with a faint hiss. The candle's glow spread across the room, soft and warm, banishing the shadows for the first time in what felt like years. The children watched as the light flickered over Miss Winter's face, softening the harsh lines etched by time and sorrow. For a moment, the house didn't feel so cold. "You've done your good deed," Miss Winter said, turning back to them. "But be careful. Light can reveal things best left hidden." The words hung in the air like smoke, filling the children with a sense of unease they couldn't quite name. But they didn't leave. Not yet. Instead, Margot leaned forward. "Maybe light is exactly what you need." Miss Winter's eyes narrowed, but she didn't send them away. Not yet. The flicker of the candle's flame seemed to breathe life into the sitting room, casting long, shifting shadows that danced on the walls like whispers of the past. Miss Winter stood by the mantel, her pale hands resting on its edge, her sharp eyes fixed on the children. The red candle, small as it was, seemed to warm the air, making the house feel less like a tomb. Margot and Elias sat stiffly on the faded settee, their boots leaving faint puddles on the worn rug. They didn't dare move, afraid the fragile truce they had forged with this enigmatic woman might shatter with the wrong word or glance. "You came here to bring me Christmas," Miss Winter said, after a long silence, her voice quiet but weighted. "Do you know what that means?" Elias tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. "It means we didn't want you to feel alone." Miss Winter turned to him, and for the first time, her lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. "Alone," she echoed, her voice softening. "That's an honest answer, at least." Her gaze shifted to the basket Margot still clutched tightly in her lap. "What else have you brought?" Margot hesitated, then reached inside to pull out the gingerbread cookies, their spice scent curling into the air. She held them out, and Miss Winter took one, her fingers brushing against Margot's for the briefest of moments. The older woman didn't eat the cookie. Instead, she studied it, her brow furrowing. "When I was a girl," she said almost to herself, "I used to bake these with my mother. She had a copper tin shaped like a star." Her voice trailed off, and her expression grew distant, as though she was seeing a memory play out in the flickering candlelight. "Do you still bake?" Elias asked, his voice breaking the spell. Miss Winter's gaze snapped back to him, her eyes narrowing slightly. "No," she said curtly. "I stopped long ago." She placed the cookie carefully on the mantel, beside the candle, as though it were an offering. "Why?" Margot asked, her curiosity outweighing her caution. Miss Winter turned back to the fire, the lines of her face deepening in the shifting light. "Because there are some things you leave behind," she said, "even if they never truly leave you." The children exchanged a glance, sensing the fragility in her voice. The silence in the room thickened, pressing down like a heavy blanket. Finally, Elias pointed to the piano tucked into the far corner of the room, its dark wood gleaming faintly beneath a layer of dust. "Did you play?" he asked. Miss Winter followed his gaze, and a shadow passed over her face. "Once," she said, "but music can be cruel." Margot tilted her head. "How can music be cruel?" Miss Winter's fingers curled tightly around the edge of the mantel. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she moved to the piano, her movements slow and deliberate, like a ghost retracing the steps of its former life. She lifted the lid, the sound of the wood creaking echoing in the stillness. Her fingers brushed the keys, their ivory surfaces worn smooth by years of use. "Music remembers," she said softly. "Every note, every melody. It lingers, no matter how hard you try to silence it." Her hands hovered over the keys for a moment, trembling slightly. Then she pressed down, and a single haunting note rang out, filling the room with a sound that seemed to hang in the air long after it had ended. Margot and Elias leaned forward, their eyes wide. "Play something," Margot urged, her voice almost a whisper. Miss Winter shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "You don't understand. Music was my life, and then it became my prison." "What happened?" Elias asked. His voice filled with a quiet, careful curiosity. Miss Winter's shoulders sagged, and for a moment she looked as though she might not answer. But then she turned back to the children, her eyes gleaming with a mixture of sorrow and defiance. "I was a musician," she said, "a violinist. I played in halls that glittered with crystal chandeliers, where people dressed in their finest to hear me. And I loved it, more than anything. Until one night a fire broke out. The hall burned to the ground. I lost everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. "Your family?" Margot asked hesitantly. Miss Winter nodded, her expression unreadable. "My family, my voice, my will to play. After that, I came here to this house. I locked my music away along with the memories." Margot's heart ached for the woman, but Elias spoke before she could find the words. "Maybe locking it away isn't the answer," he said. Miss Winter studied him, her pale eyes narrowing. "And what do you know of loss, boy?" Elias didn't flinch. "Not much," he admitted. "But I know that memories aren't prisons. They're gifts, even the sad ones." For a long moment, Miss Winter said nothing. Then she closed the piano lid, the sound of it settling into place echoing through the room. "You two are more trouble than I expected," she said quietly. But her tone lacked the sharpness it had carried before. And though she didn't say it, the candle's glow seemed brighter now, the room warmer. The silence that followed wasn't so heavy, It felt alive. The red candle burned steadily on the mantel, its warm light weaving shadows that swayed like dancers along the faded walls. Miss Winter sat by the piano, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of its closed lid, as if deciding whether to lift it again. Margot and Elias waited in silence, the weight of her story still hanging heavy in the air. The children felt like they had stepped into a place suspended in time, where every word and gesture carried a gravity they did not yet fully understand. Elias, ever curious, broke the silence first. If music was your life, don't you miss it? Miss Winter's hand paused, her pale fingers lingering over the dark wood. Her head tilted slightly, as if the question had struck a distant chord within her. Sometimes, she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. But what good is music when no one is left to hear it? Margot leaned forward, her small hands clasped tightly together. "We're here," she said. "We'll listen." Miss Winter turned to look at them, her expression softening just enough to reveal a flicker of vulnerability beneath the stoic mask. "You're too young to understand what it means to pour your soul into something, only to have it broken beyond repair." Elias tilted his head, considering her words. "Maybe it's not broken," he said. "Maybe it's just waiting for someone to fix it." Miss Winter let out a soft, bitter laugh, but there was no malice in it. "You children are relentless," she said. Yet, as she spoke, her fingers moved to the latches on a trunk tucked into the corner of the room. Its leather was cracked with age, and its brass fittings gleamed faintly in the candlelight. With a faint creak, the trunk opened, and from it, Miss Winter lifted a violin. The instrument was beautiful, despite the years of neglect. Its varnish worn, its strings dulled but intact. She held it with a reverence that suggested it was more than an object. It was a fragment of her soul, long buried and now unearthed. Margot and Elias watched, their breaths held as Miss Winter tucked the violin beneath her chin. For a moment, she stood perfectly still, her eyes closed as though summoning courage from a place deep within. Then she played. The first note rose into the air, soft and tentative, like a fragile bird testing its wings. But as her ball moved, the sound grew, filling the room with a melody that was haunting and beautiful all at once. It spoke of loss and longing, of joy remembered and pain endured. The children sat spellbound, their small bodies still as the music wrapped around them like a shimmering veil. Miss Winter's face, so often cold and distant, softened as the music poured from her. Her eyes remained closed, and for the first time she seemed unburdened, as though the notes carried away the weight she had carried for so long. When the final note faded, the silence that followed was profound. The children stared at her, their eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. "That was beautiful," Margot whispered, her voice trembling. Miss Winter lowered the violin, her hands shaking slightly. It was just a song, she said, though her voice wavered with emotion. It was more than that, Elias said firmly. It was alive. Miss Winter turned to him, and for a moment the two of them simply looked at each other. Then she placed the violin carefully back in its case and closed the lid. "You brought me Christmas," she said softly, almost to herself. "Not the kind with tinsel and carols, but the kind I thought I'd lost forever." Margot reached into her pocket and pulled out a small golden bell, its surface catching the light of the candle. She stood and approached the mantel, her boots making faint scuffs against the wooden floor. "This is for you," she said, placing the bell beside the candle. "It's not much, but it's for new memories." Miss Winter stared at the bell, her expression unreadable. Then, to the children's astonishment, she smiled. A real, genuine smile that softened the lines of her face and made her seem almost young. "You've given me more than you know," she said quietly. "Perhaps it's time I learned to give again." The children didn't fully understand her words, but they felt the weight of them. The house, once so cold and lifeless, seemed to pulse with a quiet warmth, as though the music had awakened something that had been sleeping for far too long. As the children rose to leave, Miss Winter followed them to the door. The snow had started falling again, its flakes swirling in the faint light of the village lamps. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but steady, "for reminding me." Margot turned back to her, smiling brightly. "Merry Christmas, Miss Winter." Miss Winter watched them disappear into the snowfall, her hand resting lightly on the golden bell. For the first time in years, the silence of her house felt like something other than emptiness. It felt like the beginning of a song. The snow fell heavier as Margot and Elias made their way home, their footsteps swallowed quickly by the white. Yet their hearts felt lighter, as though something intangible had shifted not just in Miss Winter's house, but in the entire village of Hollowpine. By the time they reached their cottage, the fire was burning low, and the house was steeped in the comfortable quiet of a late winter's evening. Their mother and father were waiting, their faces a mixture of worry and curiosity. "Did she?" their mother began, but the words faltered. "She's not what people say," Margot interrupted, her voice bright and defiant. "She's sad, lonely, but she's kind." "And she played for us," Elias added, his eyes wide with wonder. "It was like nothing I've ever heard." Their father exchanged a glance with their mother, something unspoken passing between them. "It seems you've done more than bring her Christmas," he said softly. That night, as the children lay in bed, the sound of the wind outside seemed less like a howl and more like a melody, faint but full of promise. Christmas morning dawned bright and clear, the snow glinting like scattered diamonds under a pale winter sun. Hollowpine came alive with the sounds of laughter and the chiming of bells as villagers exchanged gifts and warm greetings. Yet there was something different in the air, a subtle shift that no one could quite put into words. It wasn't until the church bells rang for morning service that the change became clear. As the villagers gathered in the square, wrapped in scarves and carrying baskets of treats, they saw her. Miss Elara Winter. She stood at the edge of the square, her dark coat blending into the shadows of the trees. Her presence was a shock, and for a moment, no one moved. She had not stepped beyond the bounds of Sparrow Lane in years, and her sudden appearance was like seeing a phantom made flesh. But then, from the crowd, Margot broke free, running to her with an enthusiasm that cut through the tension like sunlight piercing clouds. Elias followed close behind, his breath puffing in the cold. "You came!" Margot cried, beaming up at Miss Winter. The older woman hesitated, her pale hands clutching the handle of a small, leather-bound case. "I thought it was time," she said, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. Before she could say more, Elias spotted the case. "Is that your violin?" Miss Winter nodded, and for the first time, her faint smile reappeared. "I thought I might play, if anyone wants to hear." The crowd stirred, a murmur rippling through the villagers as they exchanged looks. Then the pastor, an older man with kind eyes, stepped forward and extended his hand. "We would be honored," he said simply. With a nod, Miss Winter stepped into the center of the square, where a low wooden platform had been cleared of snow for the carolers. She set the violin case down carefully, her movements slow and deliberate. As she lifted the instrument to her chin, the crowd fell into a hush so profound that even the wind seemed to still. Then she began to play. The first notes were soft, tentative, like the memory of a song half forgotten. But as the bowl moved, the melody grew, unfurling like the petals of a winter rose. It was a song unlike any the villagers had heard, haunting and luminous, filled with both sorrow and hope. It seemed to weave itself into the very fabric of the morning, rising and falling like the breath of the earth. People closed their eyes, tears slipping down cheeks unnoticed. The music spoke to something deep and hidden within them, memories of loss, of love, of moments too fleeting to hold on to, but too precious to forget. Margot and Elias stood at the edge of the crowd, their hands clasped tightly together. They watched as the village, once so divided in its whispers about Miss Winter, was drawn together by her music. When the final note faded into the crisp morning air, a silence followed, deep and reverent. Then, slowly, the villagers began to clap, their applause building until it echoed off the snowy hills. Miss Winter lowered the violin, her shoulders trembling. She looked out at the crowd, at the faces no longer filled with fear or suspicion, but with gratitude and awe. For the first time in years, she felt something stir within her, a warmth that melted the icy walls she had built around herself. "Merry Christmas," she said softly, the words carrying through the square like another melody. The bell tower rang out above her, its clear tones mingling with the golden bell Margot had placed on her mantle the night before. And from that day forward, the house at the end of Sparrow Lane was no longer a place of shadows. It became a home once more, filled with music and laughter, its doors open to the world. And every Christmas Eve, the villagers would gather there to listen to Miss Winter play. Her melodies a gift that reminded them all of the true meaning of the season, the power of light to break through the darkness, and the enduring magic of giving. Thus, Hollow Pine was forever changed, its winters warmed by the music of a woman who had once thought herself lost, but had found her way back, guided by the courage of 2 children and the flicker of a red candle's flame.